In a quiet village nestled among the misty hills, there lived a humble monk named Sona. He was known not for grand sermons or mystical powers, but for the way he walked slowly through the market each morning, palms together, offering a gentle nod to every soul he passed. He never asked for anything, yet he never seemed to lack. The children would follow him sometimes, mimicking his slow steps and quiet smile. The elders would offer him fruit or warm tea, and he always bowed in gratitude, even if he declined. One day, a merchant came to the village, tired from his travels and hardened by loss. His business had failed, his wife had left him, and his heart had grown cynical. When he saw Sona walk by, nodding with his usual serene expression, the merchant scoffed. "You walk like a man who's never suffered," he spat. "What do you know of compassion?" Sona stopped, bowed, and said nothing. But the next day, he returned to the market with a story. He spoke softly, drawing a small group around him. Once there was a farmer who found a bird caught in a thorn bush. Its wings were torn, and it bled onto the dry earth. He could have walked away, telling himself it was not his problem. But instead, he knelt. He spent hours freeing the creature, cleaning its wounds and sheltering it through the night. The bird never sang again. It never flew again. But it sat on his shoulder each morning as he worked, silent but present. The villagers listened in stillness. The merchant folded his arms but didn't walk away. The farmer, Sona continued, never spoke of the bird to anyone. When asked why he bothered, he simply said, "If I turned away every time I saw suffering, I'd forget how to see at all." That night, the merchant did not sleep well. He dreamed of a small bird resting on his shoulder, pressing its body to his neck, its warmth impossible to ignore. The days passed, and he began to watch the monk more carefully. He noticed how Sona paused beside the weaver who had lost her child, how he swept the leaves from the old carpenter's step without being asked, how he listened, truly listened, when the young potter spoke of his fears about leaving the village. The merchant's heart, so used to walls and iron locks, began to ache, but not in the way pain usually did. It was softer, like a quiet knock, asking to be let in. He remembered his own mother, long dead now, how she used to press her hand to his forehead when he was sick, how she once said, "Kindness is not about deserving. It's about recognizing the wound in another as if it were your own." Weeks later, a dog was hit by a cart outside the village. The animal cried out and lay in the dust, twitching. People passed by, some averting their eyes. But the merchant ran to it, knelt down, tore his own robe to wrap the wound, and carried the dog to shelter. He stayed beside it through the night, whispering nothing, just breathing, present. In the morning, Sona appeared. He said nothing, only placed a small bowl of water beside them and bowed. The merchant looked up, tears tracing the lines of his weathered face. "I didn't do it to prove anything," he said. "I just couldn't walk away." Sona smiled, the kind of smile that carried centuries in its curve. "That," he said, "is compassion. There is a truth often overlooked. Compassion is not always grand. It is not measured by applause or recognition. It is the quiet decision to sit with pain, not to fix, but to witness. To offer warmth even when it may not be returned. To act not because it will change the world, but because it refuses to let the world change us. In a world so quick to rush past hurt, the most radical act is to stop, to see, to feel. And so the village changed, not through sermons or rules, but through the simple repetition of one soul recognizing another. There was a time long ago when a young prince named Kima stood at the edge of a battlefield, not one of war, but of his own heart. He had been raised among gold and silk, told he was destined for greatness, and trained to lead without hesitation. But he had also learned to see weakness as a threat, vulnerability as failure, and compassion as a luxury reserved for poets and priests. Then came the famine. The crops failed, the river receded, and his people grew thin. Their voices no longer rang with celebration, but with the quiet desperation of survival. Kima, surrounded by advisors urging him to hoard and strategize, struggled with a question he had never been taught to answer. What does it mean to be strong when others are weak? One evening, he disguised himself in common robes and walked among the people. What he saw haunted him: children sleeping on stone, old men trading the last of their grain for a spoonful of milk, women holding empty pots over cold fires. But what struck him most was a beggar who offered his only blanket to another shivering woman. When Kima asked why he had done it, the beggar replied simply because she needed it more. That night, Kima dreamed of a vast ocean. In the dream, he stood on its edge, holding a single cup of water. "What good is this?" he cried. But a voice answered, "The ocean is made of many small cups." The next day, Kima opened the palace gates. He ordered food stores to be shared freely. He walked beside oxen carts, distributing rice with his own hands. His advisors warned him of weakness, but he said, "If compassion is weakness, then let history forget my strength." One day, a monk named Anura arrived. He had heard of the prince who walked with the poor and ate with the hungry. He sat with Kima beneath a neem tree and asked, "What changed you?" Kima told him the story of the beggar's blanket. Anura nodded. "You've seen that the heart, when closed, may protect, but when open, it transforms." He then shared a parable. There was once a lotus trapped beneath the mud. It had never known the sun, never felt the wind, but deep within it carried a memory not of form, but of direction. So it grew, slowly, blindly, toward the surface. Many days passed. Rocks scraped it. Fish nibbled it. Still it climbed, until one morning it broke through and the sunlight kissed its petals. In that moment it did not become a flower. It remembered it had always been one. Kima sat silently, his heart heavy with something new joy, perhaps, but a deeper kind. One that arrived not from being right or rich or revered, but from finally understanding the dignity of another's need. As the weeks passed, the famine slowly lifted. Rains came, crops rose, but something had changed beyond the fields. People smiled more readily. Strangers helped each other lift burdens. At the market, a woman gave away half her bread and said, "It is what the prince would do." And Kima? He no longer walked in silk, but in humility. When people thanked him, he said it was never mine to give, only mine to see. The story reminds us that leadership is not about control, but about care. That compassion, when acted upon, expands beyond its source and ripples quietly through the world. It is not a show. It is not a slogan. It is the steady, humble practice of presence, of seeing another's suffering and choosing not to look away. Sometimes it is a blanket, sometimes a cup of rice, Sometimes simply listening with your whole heart. And sometimes it is remembering that in helping another bloom, we return to the light ourselves. A long time ago, in the quiet mountains of the East, there was an old woman known only as Amma. She lived in a simple hut made of wood and stone, surrounded by trees that whispered stories to the wind. She was not a monk, not a teacher, not anyone the world would consider important. But travelers from distant lands made their way up the narrow path to her door, seeking something they couldn't name peace, perhaps, or understanding. One evening a young man arrived, weary and bitter. His name was Delan, and his eyes held the weight of betrayal. He had lost his closest friend in a cruel business deal. The friend had taken everything: money, trust, even his future. And Delan had come not for comfort, but for answers. He believed forgiveness was weakness, and he wanted permission for his anger. Amma served him tea without a word. They sat in silence, and the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. Finally, Delan broke the stillness. "He ruined me," he said. "Everyone tells me to forgive, but why should I? Why let him walk free while I carry the pain?" Amma placed her cup down and leaned forward. "There was once a man," she began, "who carried a heavy rock on his back. He walked with it every day, bent and tired. When asked why he didn't put it down, he said, 'Because the one who gave it to me deserves to be reminded of what he did.' But the truth was, the man who gave it had long since walked away unburdened, unaware, and unchanged." Deland looked away, his throat tight. "So," Amma said, "who is suffering more, the one who did the harm or the one who carries it?" He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Over the next few days, Delan stayed. He watched Amma care for the garden, tend to the birds, and sweep her small porch every morning as though it were sacred. She never preached. She only did what needed doing with calm and care. One morning she handed Delan a seed. "Plant this," she said. He did. And every morning after, she brought him water and a little silence. Weeks passed. The seed became a sprout. And slowly, Delan began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness. One afternoon, he said, "I don't know how to forgive him." Amma smiled gently. "You're not forgiving him for his sake. You're forgiving him because your hands are too full to grow anything new." And just like that, he understood. Compassion isn't always soft. Sometimes it is fierce. It says, "I will not let your wrongness ruin what I still have left to love." It refuses to become like the pain that birthed it. It dares to remain open in a world that teaches us to shut down. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without bitterness. It is walking away without chains. It is planting something new, even in soil once poisoned. Before Delan left, Amma gave him the smallest of smiles and said, "You've begun the hardest journey, the one back to yourself." And as he walked down the winding path, the trees whispering all around him, he felt no need to look back. Because for the first time in years, he was not chasing revenge. He was walking toward peace. There was a remote village near the bend of an ancient river, a place where time moved slowly and seasons whispered their arrival through rustling leaves and shifting scents. In this village lived a boy named Arun, curious and thoughtful, known for asking questions no one else dared to voice. One day, Arun came to the village elder, a retired monk named Nanda, who spent his days carving wooden figures and feeding the birds. The boy's eyes were heavy with confusion. Why do people hurt each other if we're all supposed to be kind? Arun asked. Why do those who care always seem to suffer the most? Nanda set down his carving tool and motioned for Arun to sit beside him beneath the old Bodhi tree. Let me tell you a story, he said, his voice like soft gravel, smoothed by years of use. There was once a candle who believed it was being punished. Every night it was lit and left to burn, watching its own wax drip away. It cried out, "Why must I lose myself in this fire?" But one evening a wanderer came through the darkness, shivering and lost. The candle's flame lit his path, warmed his hands, and led him safely home. The candle never knew this. It only knew the pain of melting. Arun sat very still. Nanda continued, "Sometimes we don't see the impact of our warmth, but that doesn't mean it isn't felt." He paused, letting the silence settle. Compassion is not about being thanked. It's about being lit again and again, even when we know we will melt. And yes, that can hurt. But it's also how we give light to a world that's often too dark to see itself. Arun looked down at his hands. But what if I don't want to be the one who melts? What if I want to stay whole? That's not weakness, Nanda said gently. It's wisdom beginning to ask better questions. The real path is not about self-erasure. It's about choosing when to shine and when to rest. A burned-out candle helps no one, but one that burns with awareness, that's a different kind of light. That night, Arun sat outside his home, watching the stars blink into existence. He thought of his own heart like a flame small, yes, but steady. And he wondered how many others walked through their nights, searching for just a little warmth. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way his mother sighed when no one was listening. How the baker sometimes gave extra bread without charging. How the old fisherman hummed a song only when alone. It dawned on him that compassion wasn't always a grand act. Sometimes it was a quiet presence, a pause before reacting, a hand extended when judgment was easier. One morning, he saw a classmate crying by the well. The boy had broken his father's only fishing rod and feared the anger waiting at home. Arun sat beside him and didn't say a word. He didn't offer advice. He didn't offer solutions. He just stayed. Later, the boy whispered, "Thank you." For what? Arun wondered. I didn't do anything, but perhaps he had done exactly what was needed. The truth is, we often search for heroic ways to help others, grand solutions, powerful words, life-changing interventions. But sometimes the most profound compassion lies in simply being willing to be present, to not flinch in the face of another's suffering, to let someone else feel seen. And perhaps that is enough. In the midst of a thick forest, hidden far from the path of kings and markets, lived a deer with golden fur. Its coat shimmered like the morning sun, and its eyes held the calm of still water. The creatures of the forest spoke of the deer with reverence, not because it was powerful, but because it never turned away from suffering. One dry season, when water vanished from shallow streams and the wind turned sharp with hunger, a desperate hunter entered the forest. He was a poor man, with torn sandals and sorrow in his heart. His family had not eaten in days. When he saw the golden deer drinking from a pool that had survived the heat, he raised his bow. But just as he released the arrow, something happened. The deer turned and looked directly at him, not with fear, but with recognition. The arrow froze in mid-air, caught in the hunter's own hesitation. And then the deer did something unexpected. It stepped toward him. "I know why you came," it said softly, for in the old stories, truth could speak through nature. "You seek to feed your family." The hunter dropped his bow, trembling. "Yes, but I didn't know you could speak." "All hearts speak," the deer replied, "but most are too loud to hear them." Moved beyond words, the hunter fell to his knees. "Then take my life. I cannot harm a being like you." But the deer shook its head. Compassion is not choosing one life over another. It is finding a way both may live. And so the golden deer led the hunter deeper into the forest, to a hidden glen where fruit still grew and roots ran sweet beneath the earth. It showed him the plants that healed and the paths that led to water. In time, the hunter returned to his village, not with meat, but with knowledge enough to grow and gather to survive without killing again. Word of the golden deer spread. Some came to hunt it for its pelt, others to worship it, but it was never found again. Only stories remained of a creature who taught that mercy is greater than fear, and that survival need not come at the cost of another's life. In the village, the hunter became known as a healer. He taught his children that strength lies not in taking, but in giving, that the forest speaks if you learn to listen, and that the deepest power is the one that chooses restraint. The parable asks us to reconsider the way we measure survival. Compassion doesn't mean passivity. It means having the courage to see beyond the immediate, to recognize that desperation blinds us, but kindness restores our sight. In our own lives, we often draw our bows ready to defend, to accuse, to win. But what if we paused? What if we asked, what else is possible here? The arrow we don't release might save more than a life. It might save our humanity. And like the golden deer, we become more than what we appear, guides for others, reminders that even in hunger, even in fear, the heart can choose light. There was once a monk named Tenzin who had grown old in the hills, his beard white like ash and his back slightly bowed by time. He had lived a life of quiet routine, chanting, sweeping, meditating, and was known throughout the valley for his wisdom. But there was something no one knew. Tenzin had once carried a grudge that lasted for decades. Many years earlier, when he was still a young monk filled with ambition, Tenzin had been betrayed by his closest friend, another monk named Ryu. They had studied under the same teacher, shared the same cell, and dreamed of founding a temple together. But one day, Ryu left without a word, taking with him all their plans and a rare manuscript that had been entrusted to them both. Tenzin had never spoken of it, not to the abbot, not to the trees, not even to himself. But every time he lit incense, a part of him burned too. Not from the flame, but from the silence that wrapped itself around his resentment. Then, one spring morning, as the plum blossoms began to fall like pink snow, a stranger arrived at the monastery gate. It was Ryu. His hair was thin now, and his hands trembled. He bowed deeply before Tenzin and said, "I have carried shame for many years. I came not to explain, but to ask, will you speak with me?" Tenzin said nothing for a long while. Then he motioned for Ryu to follow. They walked in silence to a small stream behind the monastery. The water ran clear, dancing over smooth stones. Tenzin reached into his robe and pulled out a small black stone. "I've carried this for 30 years," he said. "Each time I remembered you, I would squeeze it. It reminded me of what was taken, of what I lost." Then he placed the stone gently into the water and watched it disappear beneath the current. "Why now?" Ryu asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tenzin looked up. "Because forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means I'm no longer willing to be a prisoner of that moment. The door was always open. I just stopped believing I could walk out." The two men sat by the water until the sun dipped low. From that day forward, they met often. Not to relive the past, but to share the present. They worked in the garden, sat through the rains, and chanted quietly under the moonlight. And though their friendship never returned to what it once was, it grew into something else, honest, fragile, and true. The story of Tenzin and Ryu spread quietly through the valley, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And people began to understand something important. Compassion for others is only half the journey. The other half is compassion for ourselves, for the parts that feel betrayed, wounded, or ashamed. And sometimes it takes courage not to act, but to release. We are all carrying stones, some in our hands, some in our hearts. But the moment we choose to let them go, we don't just free ourselves, we make space for something new to grow. And like the stream that carried Tenzin's stone away, life moves on with or without our pain. It is we who must decide whether to flow with it or keep standing still. Compassion, like a gentle river, flows quietly but persistently through the landscapes of our lives. It is not always loud or grandiose, but it carries the power to soften hardened hearts and mend unseen wounds. The stories we have shared remind us that compassion begins not with others, but with ourselves, accepting our own imperfections, our struggles, and our moments of doubt. In a world that often feels fractured by fear, anger, and disconnection, choosing compassion is an act of courage. It asks us to light a candle even when the flame threatens to flicker out, to release grudges that weigh heavy on the spirit, and to extend a hand without expecting anything in return. True compassion is the art of presence, being there fully, in silence or in speech, in joy or in sorrow. It teaches us that every life, every story matters. That healing begins with listening, understanding, and allowing space for transformation. As we walk our paths, may we carry these parables close, like seeds planted deep within. May they bloom into acts of kindness, moments of grace, and a steadfast heart that meets the world with open arms. After all, compassion is not a destination, but a journey, one step, one breath, one story at a time.